Good evening. I stayed in a brothel once in the mistaken belief it was a local kind of holiday inn. I found out the truth in the middle of the night in circumstances that would be painful and difficult now to describe. What made it particularly worrying was that it was in a town called San Miguel in the centre of El Salvador, at that time under siege from a particularly bloodthirsty group of rebels, and the customers were the government troops who were supposed to be keeping them at bay. The operation was conducted on army lines, i.e. loudly, by numbers and in strict order of seniority. My well-bred distaste for vice was magnified by the very real fear of being murdered in my, chaste by the way, bed. Ever since then, the word brothel has sent the wrong kind of shiver down my spine. Did so again this week, when the most senior health official in the northwest of England, Professor John Ashton, appealed for brothels here to be made legal and prostitution to be licensed. His reasons were essentially pragmatic. Sexually transmitted diseases like gonorrhea and syphilis are spreading fast and are increasingly resistant to antibiotics. Legislation would make them easier to control. There are other arguments. It might separate commercial sex from organised crime, for instance. Licensing brothels would go some way, perhaps, to redress the balance of exploitation between men and women. In any case, is it so very wrong? Some would say it's a safety valve for society. And selling sex is not in itself a crime. Is it actually immoral? And perhaps a wider thought. Is the concept of reducing harm, as in this case, a proper basis for morality in the 21st century? But essentially, the question is, should brothels be legal? Our moral maze. Tonight, our panel, the constitutional historian, Dr. David Starkey, Claire Fox from the Institute of Ideas, the Catholic commentator, Joanna Bogle, and the philosopher, Janet Radcliffe-Richards. Philosophers are working girls too, Janet, I suppose. What's your line on this?
On prostitution, I don't think anyone would choose to be a prostitute as their first choice of profession, but I do think that you will never get rid of it, and that most of the harm now comes from the very fact that it is illegal.
David Starkey.
Michael, I prostitute myself every week, regularly as clockwork. I sell the most important part of my body in frequently unpleasant company. It's called appearing on the moral maze. I cannot for the life of me see the difference between selling one's mind and selling one's body. There is merely atavistic prejudice.
Joanna Bogle.
I'm very cynical about the way we all have to pretend to think that there are no morals involved where sex is involved. Because it's to do with sex, you have to say, make it legal, make it safe. Prostitution is a wretched way of life. It's immoral. Let's be honest about this and stop having to be so coy wherever sex is involved.
Claire Fox.
There's something about a sexual act that engenders so much intimacy and tells us so much about what it is to be human that even in its most fleeting one-night stand sense, it's actually rather beautiful, dare I say it. And the idea of turning it into something you buy and sell in the marketplace is just grim. I don't like it very much. I'll tell you what I think about legalising it later.
All right, but you have an aesthetic to
How
state
very
for it, at least.
coy, I think, Claire.
Anyway, our first witness is Professor John Ashton, whose name I've already mentioned, who's the Regional Director of Public Health for the North West of England, and the man who caused such a stir this week over this issue. He's on a line from our studio in Liverpool. Professor Ashton, your focus is, of course, and understandably, on public health. But do you personally have a moral view? Do you think selling sex is wrong?
Well, I think having been brought up in the Christian tradition, but having trained in public health and now having responsibility for advising on the health of the Northwest with 7 million people and a number of cities and towns with big red light districts, I think I've become very pragmatic about these things. And I suppose the philosophy from which public health derives its roots is utilitarianism, really, and coupled with some deference to autonomy and non-malevolence. The philosophers there would probably familiarise themselves with that.
Joanna Bogle, your witness.
Yes, don't you think that the idea of taking a purely pragmatic approach, in other words, sort of saying you really have no principles from which you're operating, is a bit worrying in a public health official?
No, I think we have to do that quite frequently. I mean, going back here to the 1980s, when HIV first appeared, in Liverpool, we took a very pragmatic view and we set up the first large-scale syringe exchange programme in the country, and that we've been vindicated for doing that because the levels of HIV among injecting drug users on Merseyside are much lower than they should be. I think public health has got to obviously be situated within the moral and cultural climate in which it operates, but it can't be dictated to by it, or we would get into a real mess.
But it is being dictated to by it, isn't it, by you? Because the moral and cultural climate in which we find ourselves is essentially this one where we all have to pretend there are no moral values. And isn't that rather a pointless place from which to start, especially on something which involves the vulnerable and young people and the marginalised and sort of immigrants and so on in the way that prostitution does?
Well, it's certainly not where I start. I mean, the press release that I put out last week began by saying that the safest sex is monogamous sex. And really, in my view, the most desirable and enjoyable form of sex is within the context of a loving relationship. But I have to live in the real world. And in the real world, we know that even people who profess strong religious beliefs sometimes get into difficulties. We've had all sorts of scandals with Catholic priests, with all sorts of people with Magdalene laundries, with things. And I think we have to be realistic about what goes on in the real world and try to work with the with the grain of human nature, really.
I understand. Claire Fox?
John, I'm all for realism. One of the things that I dread that might emerge from your campaign, however, is the state running our sex lives, which does terrorise me. I mean, when you talk about the regulation, don't you see this as just inviting the state into the most intimate part of our lives and endorsing the idea that politicians should say what goes on in the privacy of people's, as it were, behind closed doors? That's my concern.
No, I think I agree with you there. I mean, I think my concern is that if you consider food poisoning and outbreaks of food poisoning, which we have to deal with on a fairly regular basis, we know where all the premises are. We can go and investigate them and sort out the problem. Last year we were faced with a big increase in gonorrhea in Manchester, a lot of which was resistant to penicillin. And when I asked for the list of massage parlours, nobody could give it to me because we are irrational about this particular issue. And what I'm arguing is that if people are engaged in the sex industry, we need to know who they are, where they are, so that we can do that.
I suppose my concern, though, is despite what you're saying, when you actually encourage the state to go in, you're actually encouraging them to interfere in what people are doing privately.
We do that all the time, don't we? I mean, I think there are other bits to this equation. My own view is that I would like to see a framework in which women were in charge of their own situation. I would like to separate the pimps off. I would like to separate the drug dealers off. I would like to see a situation where to have a licence for sexual premises, women were organising it for themselves in cooperatives or that kind of thing, really.
Janet Radcliffe-Richards?
I agree with you entirely about that. What I wanted to press you further on was a question which has already arisen twice, and that's why you seem to be opposing moral to pragmatic. Aren't you saying that the morally right thing for a society to do is to set up institutions which protect women rather than allow them to be exploited? Aren't you saying this is the morally good thing to do?
I think so, yeah, partly. I mean, I have two sides to this coin, obviously. I mean, what's gone on now? What if you look at the statistics and you get the feel for the statistics, the space between the statistics, it looks as though between 5 and 10% of adults are having sex with more than one person at any one time. And that's not the same group of people. I mean,
it's
dynamic.
Group sex or
no. I mean, what I'm talking about is, you know what I'm talking about.
Yes, we know.
You do know what I'm talking about. And we might. People aspire to monogamy as people aspire to celibacy in the church, but they sometimes fail. And one of the ways in which they fail within the the normal world of adult relations is that people use commercial sex. And I think we have to put it on a basis which protects both the people who are selling commercial sex and the people who are using commercial sex.
Part of the question I was asking was, you might have one view about what was morally right for an individual with another individual, but it might still be the case that what was morally right for society as a whole would be to set up rules which allowed for this. Do you think that's so? It sounds to me as though you're taking a strongly moral position, not something which is pragmatic as opposed to moral.
No, I see what you mean. Well, I think reading between the lines, I agree with you, really. I think you're coming from the same place as I am.
I think I am. I just don't want utilitarianism to be counted as not a moral position. It is a kind
Oh, right, sorry.
Yes,
yeah,
that's
no,
all.
I mean...
Yes,
No,
yes,
well,
yes,
yeah, sure.
David Starkey?
Professor Ashton, you are aware, aren't you, that you're proposing to turn the clock back with the idea of state-regulated brothels?
Well, you obviously know more of the history of this subject than I do, and so I'd be fascinated to know what you're about to tell me.
There was a thing called the Contagious Diseases Act in the middle of the 19th century, which provided for exactly what you want, the regulation of brothels and the inspection to check for venereal disease of prostitutes. And then, do you know why it was taken off the statute book?
I'll tell you why, because it enabled the law to lock up women who were within 6 miles of a barracks because they were able to be accused of being a common prostitute. And, I think that that's not what we're talking about here.
But careful, that was only one part of the explanation. The other more important one is there was a movement called the Social Purity Movement, which tried to clean up sex and clean up Britain. Don't you think those sort of social purity movements have got an awful lot to answer for?
Well, the answer is yes. What you find in public health, as I suspect you already know, is that you tend to find two groups of people. You find the hygienists who want to clean everything up and stop people doing things, and you find people who essentially are trying to provide the conditions under which people can realise their potential, and I subscribe to the latter position.
Well, and what you're doing is, you are in fact, Michael raised the question at the beginning, what is the basis for proper public morality? What you were trying to do, and Janet made the same point, you were trying, taking the world as it is, to minimise harm.
Exactly.
Professor Ashton, thank you very much indeed. Our next witness is Julie Bindle, who's a researcher at the Child and Woman Abuse Studies Unit at the University of London, a feminist campaigner, I suppose you could be more widely described. Do you think selling sex is different from any other commercial transaction?
Yes, I do, in that women and children's bodies are not a commodity, and nor should they be seen as a commodity, in that it causes great harm to this commodity, the human beings, and there's no other profession that I can actually think about, or no other commercial exchange that has attached to it, or as an occupational hazard, issues such as HIV, AIDS, murder, rape, sexual harassment as part of the daily work of women in prostitution. And so, no, it's absolutely not the same. And we need to look at the demand side, those who are seeking these products, this what looks like an almost insatiable demand for prostituted women.
Sorry, what are you
children
saying? That far from decriminalising prostitution, you would like to criminalise the customers?
Absolutely. I would like to decriminalise it for the women. I think that criminalising women in prostitution protects them not at all.
OK, but you would like to criminalise the customers?
I would like to criminalise the customers, and I would like to actually enforce the criminalisation of the pimps.
Janet Radcliffe-Richards.
I think you may have answered the question I was going to ask you to some extent. A lot of the people who want to make these things legal and allow women to set up brothels, which they run themselves, are anxious to protect women, and they're afraid that making it illegal drives it underground with all the consequent harm that does. What do you say to those people?
I don't have a problem with women choosing, and I use the word selectively, to set up a flat to operate on her own with a colleague, and in fact I'm sure that she's relatively safer than women working on the street. In terms of the argument about driving underground women by not legalising or not decriminalising, it's utter nonsense. I mean, if you look at examples where legalisation of brothels or decriminalisation per se of prostitution and brothel keeping has been tried and tested, such as Victoria, Australia, and the new example of the Netherlands, it's been a disaster. What has happened is that it's created a new layer of prostitution and a new layer of the sex industry, which is the legal layer. If we can imagine the pimps who are selling children, selling foreign women, peddling pornography, illegal pornography, can we imagine them really not doing that and paying taxes and being happy about that? Of course, if they're keeping it, they're thriving.
We can't imagine they're not doing it. The question is whether you would get less of it. We know that whenever you get anything which is in demand, it's going to be supplied somehow. If it's illegal, it's all going to be supplied illegally and all uncontrolled. Surely the fact that some of it is uncontrolled is less bad than having all of it uncontrolled.
No, I mean, the examples from the two places I cited have actually made it worse. There's now more prostitution. There's more child prostitution in Victoria
As a
than ever
result of the
before.
legislation?
As a result of legalisation, it is thought by the researchers, by the government researchers and the independent researchers and the anecdotal evidence from the brothel keepers, from the women, it's actually made it worse. And what has happened is that although that the motive of this wasn't to justify prostitution in the sex industry, it was to keep the women safe, what has happened is that those women who can't get jobs in brothels because their lives are more chaotic are ending up being grasped by the most insidious pimps who actually then use them for the more horrendous acts of prostitution and pornography.
Well, yes, I'm not convinced about all of that, but anyway, leave that for a moment. What about the men? An awful lot of the men who use prostitutes are men who can't get sex any other way. Do you really think that they should be regarded as criminals? For instance, disabled ones who go to Amsterdam to specialist prostitutes. There was an extremely moving film about one of those recently.
No, I don't accept that men use women in prostitution because they can't get sex any other way. I think if you cruise any kind of heterosexual bar after 10 o'clock at night, you'll see that actually the majority of men will be able to get sex quite easily.
If you're in a wheelchair.
Joanna, but we mustn't lose sight of the fact that there are male prostitutes as well. Joanna Bogle?
Yes, I was going to ask two things. One, about boys, rent boys. We seem to have seeing everything through a rather feminist prism here. And second, where do you stand on the age of consent? We were hearing earlier about the Christian campaigners, Josephine Butler, my personal heroine, I think she was a wonderful woman, who got rid of the Contagious Diseases Act. They established a law on the age of consent, but there are very, very few prosecutions, very few indeed. And I wondered where you stood on that.
Well, an interesting thing about the age of consent as relates to this issue is that, on average, the age of people entering the sex industry is 14 in the UK. And so we're talking about child abuse, which isn't recognised as such. As soon as that child wakes up and is 16, it's supposed to then be perfectly legal, a choice and normal.
Why do you think there are so few prosecutions of men who have sex with little girls in that way?
Again, it relates, I think, back to the way that we dehumanise women and children and make them a commodity. If you have a commodity, then you can abuse and use it, and it's not a human being, and that's what prostitution is doing.
Claire Fox?
Historically, as we've heard, prostitution campaigns can often be really a disguise for puritanical lecturing and ranting by people who don't like sex very much. Something of a campaign that you've been involved in called the Curb Crawlers Re-Education Programme actually strikes me as being not dissimilar. It's kind of, I'd hate to end up on it. I know it's only for men, but I mean, what do you say to them?
Okay. I mean, it absolutely wasn't.
Rather briefly, if you
Yes, it absolutely wasn't from a moral perspective, and we certainly weren't telling the men that sex is awful. I personally do not take that view. And what we were talking to the men about was the realities of prostitution, that you're giving money straight to drug dealers, that these are disenfranchised women and children, and that actually it's bad for women to be involved in prostitution.
David Starkey.
So are you claiming that you don't have a moral position on this question?
I think that a moral position is actually incongruous. I don't
Sorry,
think
well
that
then, will you tell me why you think, in a very short sentence, prostitution is wrong?
Because it is the sexual abuse of women, albeit commercialised.
No, sorry, that's not a good answer. What, in that case, do you think proper sex is?
Oh, I don't actually want to say what I think proper sex
Well,
is.
I want-
beyond that it should be a consensual mutual exchange. I'm not going to say I think it should be within marriage or within loving relationships.
Now, sorry.
That's nonsense.
But
when you buy
Biddle,
sex, it cannot be consensual. It's a
Julie
commercial
Biddle,
exchange.
forgive me. A statement that sex should be a free and mutual exchange between adults is a moral position.
No,
Why?
it's an ethical position. It's a political
What is the
position.
difference?
There's a great difference.
Would you
between
mind telling
morality
me?
and
Sorry,
ethics.
rather than just reaching that notion out of the air, will you tell me why that is not a moral position? What is the difference between ethics and morality?
Ethics can be closely related to the politics of looking at oppression and power differences, and actually I don't think that morality necessarily is. I think
Really?
morality is
So
more
it's-
judgmental.
Isn't it really, frankly, Ms. Bindle, that you're just a person of the left and you're frightened of using, as Claire Fox has put her finger on it brilliantly, a language which comes from the religious right, but you're in bed with?
I've never been so insulted in my life to be called
Well,
a
that was
person
the
of the
idea, I
left.
think.
To be called a person of the left.
Well, at least you're a bit...
Janet Radcliffe-Richards, the last question, please.
I just wanted to ask why it wasn't a free exchange. If somebody wants to give something and another person thinks that the exchange is worth a certain amount amount of money. Surely that is exactly what a free exchange is. That is, you get the two evened out by putting money on one side.
She means gratuitous. She's using language badly.
Well, no, I want to know what she says. You see, it seems to me it's a free exchange when you go to a shop and the shopkeeper gives you the thing, but you're giving money. Why is this not free?
Because in the shop it's a thing, and actually a woman, a child, is a human being.
But it's a service they're giving.
And we're talking about the most disenfranchised people with the least choice.
But they're still giving a service which they think is worth this money to them, and they would rather have
Many
that.
people consent to taking heroin, but we still recognise it is harmful, and these people take heroin out of circumstances that they wouldn't necessarily have chosen in the first place.
Julie Bindel, thanks very much indeed. Our next witness is Avedon Carroll, who's a member of an organisation called Feminists Against Censorship. I mean, it's the same basic question. Do you think prostitution is immoral?
No, I don't. I think what's immoral is creating laws that, by their very nature, end up jeopardizing the lives of the people who are involved in the industry.
What do you think about those people who do think it is wrong, who feel very strongly that prostitution is morally wrong?
They should never become prostitutes or use prostitute services.
Well done. Well done.
All right, very diplomatic. Joanna Bogle, your witness.
Yes. Why do you think we shouldn't care about one another?
My, what an amazing leap of logic, Joanna. I think we should care very much for one another, especially when it comes to people who are very often of necessity, very often when we're talking about the youngest prostitutes, they're going into prostitution because they feel they have nowhere else. They've run away very often or been forced out of homes that are hostile. We have not provided them with a comfortable place to go, and they're often running toward prostitution as a way to make a way to survive for themselves. So, if we're criminalizing them, we're making their position even more dangerous than it would be otherwise, then we're obviously not caring about them.
So
we're taking a totally immoral position.
Cutting the bubble. Why do you think that those of us who care, who think it's right to say that something is wrong, who care enough to say that, care for the victims, shouldn't? You said that all we should do is simply not become or use prostitution. I'm sure you're surprised. It's good for you.
I'm sure you must be
Please
familiar
continue
with,
to be surprised, but I want you to answer my question. I am extremely
hang on, Joanna.
I want you to answer my question.
Yes. I'm sorry, but
Avedon,
doing things that kill people is worse than allowing people to have sex we don't happen to like.
What I want to know is why you think we shouldn't care about one another. Thomas Aquinas, who had very strong views on prostitution...
also had very strong views on killing people.
And so do I, and so do other people. But why do you think we shouldn't care for one another? Why do you think that if we mind that somebody's being exploited, if they're young and vulnerable, all we should do is say, well, I won't become such a person or use such a person? Why do you think we can't care?
Joanna, I'm going to leave that question in the air.
We do care, and that's why not only in
generally
prostitution, but in other industries and in marriage do we object when we see people being exploited and abused. Prostitution's nothing special in that regard.
Claire Fox.
I'm very keen to avoid the idea of prostitutes as victims, which I think was really informed what Julie Bindel said before you came in. However, I'm very uneasy with some things that you argue, where it seems to be that the sex industry is just another industry, where it's almost like you try and justify the decriminalisation, which I'm all for, just by turning the act of selling sex into just like selling something at Tesco's. Surely this really is a degraded thing for women to do.
Have you ever been a secretary, Claire?
There are degrading services that are provided.
When I was a secretary, prostitutes
yourself,
used to tell me they felt sorry for me because
exactly
making
a virtue out of
tell us what your boss did.
Please, one at a time.
Exactly the things I hated about being a secretary were why those women got out of secretarial work and into prostitution. So there's degrading.
I think there's a real danger
degrading.
of making a virtue out of an necessity.
It's not a joke. It's not a joke. I mean, it is really, really horrible to spend 40 hours a week in a place where you are really treated like dirt. I do know prostitutes, so they're quite happy with what they do. Now, no, it's not the job for me. But, when I hear their reasons for what they do, why they do it, and how they feel about it, I know that I can't say, oh, that's a stupid reason to do that.
Okay,
because honestly, if I thought I could stand to do it, those reasons would be good enough
I
for
think
me.
there's just a real danger of turning this into a rather nice and glamorous option for women. And I think that's just as awful as kind of Julie Bindell's treating them like they all need to be protected by her and her campaigns. I just think that isn't the way to deal with this. We can know it's going on, but surely you can't seriously be saying going out and selling yourself is the same as selling
You're
your
not
capacity to
selling
make a living.
yourself. You're selling what you do. That's different. There's absolutely no way you're selling yourself. You walk out of there an hour later, or they walk out an hour later. It is not the same. Most employers expect more from you, more out of your life than most prostitutes have to give to their clients. Or than any prostitutes have to give to their clients. They can change their hours. They can decide for themselves when they're going to take holidays, and they can change their rates without notice. They have much more control over what they do.
Even
in
the
that
taxman
respect.
thinks being self-employed is better. Janet Radcliffe-Richards.
I do agree that you are not showing the least unconcern for these people and that you want to protect them. Perhaps you could answer our previous witness by saying how you would respond to her last remark, that these women don't really choose to do these things.
Many of them don't. Be perfectly honest, many of them don't. But then again, nobody aspires to be a counter clerk at McDonald's. The reason most people get into the mining industry as actual miners is not because that's what they dreamed of being. It's more because that was the best job that was going. These are extremely dangerous jobs. Things like mining, high steel work, firefighting. These are jobs that kill people.
So your idea is essentially that if somebody chooses this, it's the best option available to them.
Most people are taking what is the best option. Not all of them. Some women really like it.
Yes,
Some women,
yes.
it's different for, I admit, most of us, but some women actually love doing it.
But whatever the reason, we have no business taking away their best option on grounds of concern for them. If we want them to get out of it, we offer them better options.
We have to
and let
offer them better
take it.
options, and if we're not prepared to do that,
we make
then
their life worse.
we're just making them more miserable, But we're not talking about women who, it's a choice between I could be a highly paid executive, or I could be a streetwalker. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about I could be a streetwalker, or I could sleep in the gutter all the time.
Abaddon, can I just finish this by asking you a wider question, whether you think there are any positives for society as a whole in having prostitutes around? Do you go along with this safety valve idea?
Some prostitutes tell me they feel good about what they do. They feel they're providing a service to people who, in many cases, are very lonely, hungry for human affection, touch. And they feel good about providing that. Some of them have said that, with not all of their clients, but with some of their clients, they have a kind of a friendly relationship. I wouldn't say, a loving or close friends or anything like that, but that they feel that they're looking out for that person. And some of them just want to talk. Some of these guys come in and they want to talk to someone who will touch them. That they want to be able to feel a little bit close. And there's a lot of different things going on in prostitution. It's not just going in, having intercourse, and that's it. There's a lot more to it.
Well, there's a lot of that too, I'm sure. But Abaddon Carroll, thanks very much indeed. Our last witness is Anne Atkins, the agony aunt. Of course, there seems from some people's point of view a bit of a reluctance to take a moral absolutist stand on prostitution. Do you actually think it is, plain and simple, morally wrong?
Yes.
Why?
Because I'm coming from a Christian point of view, and therefore believe that the proper context for sex is a lifelong committed relationship. So anything outside that is wrong. Now, we don't criminalise everything outside that, but making money out of something wrong is a step further than simply allowing something wrong, I think.
And as well as thinking it should be morally wrong, do you think it should be
I don't
crime?
think it should be morally wrong. I think it is morally wrong.
All right, okay, yes, I understand. But do you think it should also be a crime, if only on the basis that it's a kind of statement of society's view of that particular
Well, I think
issue?
Our laws, one hears over and over again the argument, it happens, therefore let's legalise it, which actually we only apply to a very small section of things. Usually, I think it was Joanna that pointed out the sexual things. We don't say burglary happens, therefore, in some ways, much easier if we legalised it. The burglar would help you fill out your insurance claim and, so on and so forth. But obviously that we can see how absurd that argument is when we apply it to all crime. So that, I think, is a bit of a non-argument. But as well as...
Sorry, I don't want to go too far down this path. Do you think it should be a crime as well?
Well, what I was going to say is, yes, I think probably because as well as limiting evil, our laws actually define evil. They actually define what is right and wrong.
Good point. David Starkey, your witness.
What an extraordinary notion. So you are basing yourself firmly on a biblical notion of sex, that it should be there to form a lifelong heterosexual relationship for the procreation of children.
Well, I wouldn't say only for the procreation of children, but that...
But the Bible does.
No, it doesn't.
Yes, it does.
No, nonsense.
The Bible is extremely the Bible is extremely clear on this. Now,
wait a minute, David. I can't let you get away with that. I'm sorry.
Let us go through.
No, David. I'm sorry. I can't let you get away. The Church of England is not the Bible, David. I can't let you get away with such a complete travesty of the Judeo-Christian understanding of sex. The second chapter of Genesis clearly understands sex as part of a lifelong relationship, not just for the procreation of children. So I'm sorry, that's total rubbish.
You seem, as usual, to be at dissent with your own tradition. But
excuse me,
Anna Atkins, you've answered the question. You've disagreed with me. Let us move on.
No, but you've completely mystified me. I don't come here as an Anglican. I come as a Christian.
You come as a Christian, whatever that means. The Christian tradition that you've defined it. Let's ignore the question of children. Also, clearly excludes, and indeed, if one looks at Pauline and indeed Christ himself, excludes divorce.
Yes. And adultery and homosexuality. Yes.
And adultery and homosexuality.
And we don't criminalise all of these. That's right.
Please, Anne Atkins, let me ask the questions. Until very recently, you're there to answer them. Until very recently, all of those were criminalised on precisely the same grounds that you're now describing, weren't they? Until we grew up. Why shouldn't we grow up about prostitution?
Well, what happened over, say, let's take the question of adultery. You've got two different Christian principles.
We discovered a lot of people did it, didn't we?
Yes. Well, we've known that for thousands of years, David. That wasn't why the law changed on adultery. We've known...
Yes, it was. It changed out of humanity.
Are you saying that 2,000 years ago people didn't commit adultery?
No, but it was still criminalised.
David, I thought you were asking the questions,
one voice at a time.
Sorry, it was still criminalised, although people did it. And then we became humane. Homosexuality was criminalised. People did it, and it was done out of humanity. Why are you so inhumane about prostitution?
Well, you're putting words into my mouth. I don't think those laws were changed either because people discovered that they did them, because, as I say, adultery's been going on for a very long time.
Or I said they were changed because we became humane.
Well, that was the second reason you gave, yes.
Didn't we?
David, do please let her answer.
I don't think we're more humane now than we were 500 or 2,000.
I think we're more humane not to murder and torture homosexuals to death.
Of course I don't want us to murder or torture homosexuals. That's a total travesty of what I believe.
Do you want adulterous couples to be paraded in church in their nightshirts?
David, do you want me to answer any of these questions?
I'd like yes or no.
Would you want me to answer the first question you asked or the fifth question?
I would like you to do two things. I would like you to say, what is the difference between prostitution and all of these things?
Well, I said that at the very beginning, that prostitution is making money out of something that we know to be wrong.
But, sorry, I don't understand why that makes it a particular issue. Surely the question is whether the thing itself is inherently wrong.
Yes, OK. Well, another reason, which you haven't given me a chance to say, is what one is doing is that one is holding in tension to a certain extent two different Christian principles here. Now, the individual democracy that we have now, we have as a legacy from Christian philosophy, by and large. And that means that we want to be governed by consent. So to a certain extent, we want laws that most people go along with. Now, I think by and large, most of us would say that we don't, that we're glad that adultery is decriminalised, although adultery is still wrong.
There's a difference between the law
David,
and
I'm going to have to draw that to close. Janet Radcliffe-Richards.
Of course there is.
Well, then why did you...
Sorry, David, I think you've had your go. Janet Radcliffe-Richards.
When we make things... You talked about not legalising theft and murder. Obviously we don't, but the whole point about theft and murder is it's one person doing something which the other person totally doesn't want.
Sure.
Now, I agree that most women probably don't want to be prostitutes, but nevertheless, when a man decides to buy the services of a prostitute and she decides to give it, they have decided on a mutually beneficial exchange. So you need to explain exactly why this is wrong.
Right.
And merely saying there's money involved doesn't explain why it's
you're
wrong.
absolutely right. But there are other things that involve consenting adults that are still illegal. S&M, for instance.
But the question
drugs.
is, but again, the same question would arise about these.
Yes.
So merely saying there are others doesn't answer the question, because we want to know what would make all of them.
Sure. Well, my answer to that is that the fact that two people are consenting to do it doesn't in itself make it right. It's
But we still
wrong.
don't know what's wrong.
Well, I'm giving you from a Christian point of view.
Right.
It is wrong.
The Bible says so.
But this is not a Christian society. It's
No.
a society that
And
should it
may
be illegal? So
well,
should
it may
illegal?
be that it will gradually, become more and more decriminalised. I don't think that will actually make for better or more happy human beings, because I think what will happen then is we'll just get much, much more of it. But all I'm saying is that we do still have laws that prevent consenting adults from doing things that we think are wrong, are bad for them or wrong. So
Just
it's not an
in
anomaly.
terms of those,
Claire Fox?
Yeah, sorry. In terms of those laws, how much do you think they should be enforced? I mean, do you imagine the state spending its time going around arresting prostitutes? I mean, if you were to take the law seriously, as it were, then they're going to have an awful lot to do.
Yes, that's true, and we do sort of turn a blind eye to a certain extent. And I would hope that the police would show a certain amount of common sense in that the younger girls and the more exploited girls and so on and so forth, there would be more interference. But you see, we have, coming back to the question that Michael first asked me, the importance of keeping a law in place is that law continues to set. So, for instance,
you've
the
got
age of consent.
I'm just saying, you've got a pragmatism in relation to the application of the law, and then very quickly, you object to it because it's the buying and selling of something. I mean,
That's not
have
the
you
only
equal?
reason,
No, I know, but I'm just saying that's one thing which I have some sympathy with. That is there equal moral disdain for the man and the woman in your worldview? Who's most to blame?
I think that's
morally.
I mean, I think society's to blame. The kind of society that allows this. And I mean, how it was a pointless question. Some women are more exploited than others. Some men are more exploited.
Well, it's just we had an earlier witness who held men responsible. I just wondered whether you were.
I think it's
of that
very,
view.
very sad that the law comes down much heavier on the women, and I think that's totally illogical and stupid. But no, I wouldn't go. I'm not going to start saying who's more at fault than anybody else.
And I'm not going to press you to. Anne Atkins, thank you very much indeed. Let's just start at the beginning of all this, which Joanna Bogle with Professor Ashton, who was very convincing, and his, although the utilitarian argument wasn't the total focus of his thinking on it, he did in fact say, look, I have this problem, I have this disease problem, and made a comparison with food poisoning. Do you think that's fair? You obviously don't.
No, I didn't think he was at all convincing. HIV and everything's got progressively worse, and he's of this school of thinking that isn't doing anything about the appalling problem of sexually transmitted diseases. What about the whole question of enforcing the age of consent? I wanted to ask Anne about this. We have a law on the age of consent. It's not enforced, and we know from, for example, the number of teenage pregnancies that very, very often, in the majority of cases by an enormous proportion, the men are not prosecuted.
In relation to the issue we have at hand,
he
which
was
is
talking complete gibberish, frankly.
well, he certainly wasn't doing that. The legalisation of brothels. You think this is something that will make the problem worse rather than otherwise?
I don't think he made his case because he went off onto a tangent. I think he may well have things to say about brothels, but what he actually did was waffle, and all we got was this idea that somehow making the parallel with sort of, trying to control HIV, and he hadn't made the case where we have a very big problem of AIDS among these people. So all you got was this idea, no, we've got to say that there are no real morals, and I'm in charge of public health, and that was a
I think we've got
It depends on your definition
Janet,
of the word morality,
David.
as Janet and I have been trying to argue.
Yeah,
And
Janet,
he- and he
can you come on
didn't
this?
say, and I don't know how you can say that he's not concerned with public health when his whole point of legalising it and making it controlled is for the benefit of it. It's not reasonable to use as an argument against him that the present state of things is transmitting AIDS, because that's his whole starting premise.
But I
Claire Fox.
think you've got to be very careful, because actually it's often around campaigns in public health and health scares that actually some of the most moralising campaigns have been brought in. I mean, my concern is,
Like the age of consent.
Despite his best intention, and some of the stuff around AIDS, despite his best intention, Professor Ashton is in danger of saying, let's have more regulation, more interference, more state looking at how people are behaving sexually. And I think you have to be careful and at
all
least
he's doing
cynical.
is saying that people should be tested for venereal
There is
disease.
a difference between decriminalisation and increased regulation. He's actually calling for increased regulation.
I do think that what we've got to do is look at really three key issues, and we've only looked at them in a very sort of vague way. The first of them is why on earth we think it's wrong. And the only arguments that we've had as to why it's wrong are either biblical or based on another completely arbitrary statement that sex has to be a free exchange between adults. We all know
commodification of knowledge.
We all know that
those are not the only arguments. Excuse me, they are not.
May I
the only
finish,
arguments.
Joanna? We allowed you to talk a great deal. So we've had no convincing case. We've had no convincing case put forward on moral grounds why prostitution is wrong. We have also,
David, I don't want to interrupt you too much, but do you see selling sex as a service like any other, which is one of the issues we did?
I see it primarily as a service like any other.
Right.
And that is what I've been trying to argue.
You don't have to say like any other, though, even just to say it's a
Is
service.
this a
Of course
service?
there are
All
differences.
services involve selling part of oneself.
But I didn't like, David,
you're just displaying distaste. The distaste you're allowed to display in your
David,
own
actually,
life.
but you actually
won't
said
sell yourself.
that you prostitute yourself. You have been flippant every week when you sell your mind for this programme. But actually, I don't believe that. I would actually say that you don't sell your mind. You have an intellectual engagement. And I think that prostitution is a debasement, whether it's actually of your mind. And there are people who go out and prostitute themselves intellectually and
Are we going to
physically.
criminalise that
No,
too?
I don't. I disagree with criminalisation.
Oh, good.
This
Well,
is
so
not
let's-
the same as saying I think that humans are worth
Claire,
so little
Claire,
that they should
Claire,
sell themselves,
Claire, sorry.
their minds and their souls and their bodies as chattels. It's a horrible reflection
It is,
of the kind of
but Claire,
society we
sorry,
live in.
that is not what we're debating. We're not debating whether we like it or dislike it. We're debating whether it should be decriminalised. And the argument in favour of decriminalisation, which we haven't really talked about, is simply prohibition. Prohibiting something that a lot of people want is invariably a disaster.
I agree
Full
with
stop,
that. No, I
end of
agree with
story.
that.
Janet?
Yes, I think it is sad that this is the case, that it would be wonderful if everybody could have these ideal sexual relationships. The question is what you're going to do with all the others. And it seems to me the fact of human nature is such that there is going to be more male demand for sex than women to supply it. And as long as that's the case, unless you get repression, you are going to get an exchange which is weighted. But why is it wrong?
No,
Joanna, that's a very fastidious shudder.
I don't think that's the issue at all. I think we have not been simply put with the idea of whether or not prostitution is moral. We've also been trying to explore some of the very tragic and terrible human realities involved. And this is where David's idea that anyone can do anything is rather silly. Also, this idea we shouldn't sort of care one for another.
No,
Well, hang on a minute. There are
Joanna.
crucial areas here, like the involvement of children. We heard the age of 14 mentioned.
We've been on that.
Boys.
Janet?
Well, hang on. It's more than just doing what we want, isn't it? It's doing what we want with
but our
others.
concern of one for another is why we should have public laws which don't abandon people who get into these unfortunate positions to a worse situation by putting them into the power of men who are uncontrolled.
Can I just say that I equally dislike Janet's utilitarianism, which has kind of got this kind of view of humanity, which is lots of men might suffer if we don't supply them with sex.
I did not say...
Well, I mean, I just think it's ridiculous. And it's such a degraded way of seeing human interaction. Or, on the other hand, by the way, the other attitude... It's a caricature, that's the point. The other attitude, which is even worse, which is to moralise because you don't believe in sex outside of marriage. Just say that and have done with it. Then just ban sex as a pleasurable activity.
No, you don't ban it as a pleasurable activity. You protect people in this area as in every other. Sex is only like anything
that
else.
certain people around this table should be rapidly sent to the planet Utopia and kept there.
Let us leave it there.
Okay,
That's it.
then.
That's it for this week and for this series. From our panel, Claire Fox, Janet Radcliffe-Richards, Janet Bogle and David Starkey. Until the next one, later in the year, goodbye and be good.
The Moral Maze was presented by Michael Burke and produced by David Coombs.